In the next few minutes, I want to talk about some of the important things that you need to know when getting started with JavaScript. I'm going to cover what JavaScript is all about, what you can do with JavaScript, and how you can grow as a JavaScript developer. So, what is JavaScript? JavaScript is a popular programming language used for building web applications. Companies like Google, Amazon, Netflix actually build applications that have been thriving in the market that use JavaScript programming language. You could actually start your career as a JavaScript developer either as a front-end developer, a back-end developer, or a full-stack developer. There are many opportunities that are accessible for people who actually are starting out in JavaScript, and having an understanding of which part is best for your personality or what you actually want for your career is actually going to be a good starting point to do your research and actually start applying for positions when you're ready. So what can you do with JavaScript? Well, you could build mobile and web applications, you could actually build also streaming services, and you could build command line interface tools. These are all and many much more opportunities and things you could build with JavaScript. Being a JavaScript developer, there are many ways you could actually grow as a JavaScript developer, both technically and as a career. I have said that you could be a front-end developer, a back-end developer, or a full-stack developer. There are tools that could actually help you achieve this quite seamlessly and easily. You could use the Vue.js or the React.js or Next.js. You could use the Svelte.js, Express.js or Node.js, Nest.js to actually upskill your career and be useful in the industry. We've had the opportunity to learn what JavaScript is all about. We've also seen some of the career opportunities and the way to grow in as a JavaScript developer. So let's get started with writing JavaScript. So we want to talk about variable. Initializing a variable in JavaScript is quite simple. What's the importance of a variable? A variable helps you store information or data. You could store information like a user's name, a user's address, a user's grocery list, a user's plan, a user's calendar, and so on. You could literally store a lot of things in a variable. The way to initialize a variable is quite simple. You either start with the var command, which is actually an older method of starting naming a variable or initializing a variable, or you could go with the let command. The let command tells JavaScript that you want to actually name a variable. We could actually start name a variable like first name and give it a value. Now, if we do not give it a value, at this point is undefined because we haven't actually told JavaScript that this variable is meant to store a particular information. But what this means is if we try printing this on the console window and saying print first name, it's going to return undefined. We could try this by coming to the terminal and typing node page, and you see it's undefined. You want to always avoid situations like that by always knowing that your variable needs information as to what it's meant to store. So we could come to line 1 and give it an information either in double quotes or single quotes. We call it talent seeker. Now what this would do, it immediately says this first name is storing this information. We could now run it again, and we're soon going to see that what will be printed would be talent seeker. There are a few things to understand when actually naming variables. The first thing you need to know is that you cannot use keywords. You should always try to avoid keywords in the name of your variable. So using an information like if, which is a keyword, or class, which are keywords, would find your codes throwing errors. You want to avoid this by using more descriptive and definitive words that actually describes what the variable is for. Example, first name. The next thing you want to prevent when naming your variable is using hyphens or spaces. You want to avoid using hyphens in your JavaScript or spaces because this will throw errors as well. So if we were to call first name like this, it's going to immediately throw errors. And as you can see, it's throwing errors because it's thinking first it's its own variable, name it's its own variable. So you want to avoid that as much that to avoid any form of errors in your code. And you also want to avoid using hyphens because it's also the same thing like using spaces. It throws an error and tells you that it's not the right thing to do. The third thing you want to know when naming a variable is it needs to describe what that variable is for. It helps readability. It has to describe what the variable is for. For example, imagine if I said N and I called it talent seeker. You wouldn't really know what N represented. But if I called N Twitter handle, for example, you immediately know, okay, this is my Twitter handle and this is what the value of my Twitter handle is. So when actually naming your variables, you need to use words or phrases or group of words that actually easily describes them without using hyphens or spaces. Avoid using numbers when naming your variables. So for example, let one equals to this isn't a valid variable naming. Starting your variable naming with one, for example, basketball, is also going to throw an error and it's going to get you in trouble. So when naming your variable, avoid starting with a number and go straight to using a character, an underscore, or a text like basketball. So always remember this when trying to name your variables, and it's actually going to help you write codes that are readable, help you write codes that are understandable from other developers' perspective as well. We've understood how to initialize a variable using let and var keyword, but there are other situations where you don't want the value in that variable to change over time. Situations occur where you want the value of a variable to remain the same. Situations like that could occur when you need to store information like a API key, authorizations key, or different other information, sensitive information that do not change. And the best way to do that is to use the const function. The const function or the const keyword helps JavaScript know that this variable cannot change. So for example, if we said API key is equals to API key value, this immediately tells JavaScript that the API key cannot change its value by calling the API key to say, hey, give it a different value, like so. This will call an error if we're trying to print this in a console window by telling you that that particular line is unacceptable, that you're trying to give a value or a new value to a JavaScript constant. So you see it's throwing an error, assignment to a constant variable. So understand that there are situations where you know that assigning a new value to a variable is unacceptable, and the best way to ensure that remains the case is by using the const keyword. We've been talking about variables for the first part of the video, but we want to understand more of what kind of data a variable can store. There are two categories of data types that exist. We have the primitive data type and we have the reference data type. We're going to be focusing on the primitive data type, and we're going to try to understand the different categories or different types that exist under the primitive data type. Under the primitive data type, we have the string, we have the number, we have the boolean, we have the undefined, and we have the null. Whilst these are examples of the primitive data types, there are more information that exists out there in terms of different kinds of data that can be stored in variables. But for now, this is what we're going to start with. The string data type is what we've been used to. For example, let Twitter handle equals to underscore talent seeker. We've already used this in an example introducing variable. So this is where we can say this variable is stored in a string. We could also have the age, where it's storing my age. So we put 40. I'm not 40, but that's just an example. We could also use a boolean to check the trueness of a statement by saying is student. I'm not a student, I'm the tutor, so false. For situations where we don't know the value yet, for example, we initialized a variable but we didn't give it any value at the start, it actually takes up the value of undefined. So for example, let full name. At this point, the value is undefined. If I go to the next line to initialize another variable, full name becomes undefined. But for the sake of this section, we're going to actually give it a value of undefined. The final one is cases where we want to select student. For example, when we haven't selected any student, the value becomes null, meaning there's no student selected. But moving beyond that point, we could actually give it a different value and it takes that value. So these are the different data types that exist, or primitive types that exist in JavaScript, and this is basically the building blocks for you to actually write codes in JavaScript. So we've had conversations about primitive data type where we have strings, numbers, undefined, null, boolean. But we want to talk about reference data types, where we'd have objects, arrays, and functions. Let's talk about objects for a little bit. In objects represent real-world information like a car, a person, a house, a country, and so on and so forth. And an object helps bring different related information into one place. So for example, the Twitter handle and the age are all information that represents probably me. Although, like I said, the age is not really my age, but the point is, those information could represent data that concerns me. So there is a simpler way to represent all that information into one variable, where that variable is now identifying myself. So we could do that using the object data type. The object data type works by us initializing a simple variable, just like we do let person equals, and we have to put the information of that person in curly braces, like so. The object works in a key and a value pair method. The key represents the information just like a variable, and the value represents the value that is in that variable key. For example, the Twitter handle will be brought down here and given talent seeker. With a comma, we would say age is brought 40. With this information, we have no need for the above. This is a simple expression of how an object works in JavaScript. I could easily access both Twitter handle and age in that object by simply calling the console.log and person.twitterhandle person.age. This immediately gives me access to those values inside the object. I could also change the value inside the object by simply saying person.twitterhandle equals to volleyball coach, just like we do when we're trying to change the value in a simple variable. But this time we need to call the Twitter handle in reference to the person object. We could also change the Twitter handle by saying person Twitter handle equals to volleyball coach or talent seeker. We're changing it back to talent seeker. These two are quite the same way of doing different ways of doing the same thing. One has its importance over the other in the sense that we could do this part when we already know that it's the property that's been changed. This, on the other hand, helps us change the person Twitter handle dynamically during runtime. You could have situations where you are not sure what the user wants to change, but the user is responsible for making that change, and we could easily say let user selection equals to whatever it is that wants to be changed, and then we call user selection over here. So these are the ways to actually manipulate objects in JavaScript. And don't worry if you feel like you're not getting it, you're going to see more examples in the future as you grow using JavaScript. You're going to see more examples, you're going to see more illustrations, and this would become something particularly easy and familiar. You're going to be familiar with this as you go by. I want to talk about arrays. We've talked about objects, The next is arrays. And after that, we're going to talk about functions. So imagine if you were going shopping and you had a list of items to buy. So for example, we had shopping list for eggs, milk, and waste bin paper. In JavaScript, it's very easy to actually initialize a new variable that is in form of an array that has that list of information. So you could still use the let keyword and call it shopping list, or in the case for more to be more explicit, to be more direct with what we're trying to do, shopping array, and we could call it eggs, milk, waste bin paper. Now there's a few things I want you to realize when it has to do with arrays. Some few information, just something you need to know about arrays. The first thing you need to know about arrays is arrays starts its count from 0. What this means is to access the first element or the first item in your array, you need to actually specify 0, not 1. Array doesn't start counting from 1, but it starts counting from 0. An array can have different primitive and reference data types in it. Different data types in it, right? So you could have an object, you could have an undefined null function, you could have literally many other things inside your array. Why this is important for you to know is because right now we're using just strings in our array, but you can put in anything into your array. For example, you could call this entire thing, but rather than doing just that, you could add 20, you could add undefined, you could add null, you could add an object, an empty object, for example, and all these are still valid in an array. So for example, if I was to print this shopping array, immediately what this does for us is it prints all of it, right? It prints that entire data. This is very important to know because you might have the mindset that it's just receiving strings, but no, it can receive any different kind of data stored in a sorted ascending order from 0 to infinity. Another thing I want you to know is that the position of the elements or the items in an array can change. So for example, you currently have in your shopping array, you currently have the first element to be eggs. If you were to run this, you're going to see eggs, and you could check it that that's eggs you find there. Now, one information you need to realize is this can also not be the case if I did something like this before actually putting in eggs. So I could put on shift and I add an information like, let's say, drinks. And if I were to run this command again, you'd see that the first element is now drink. So always remember that the location and position of any item in an array can change based on the activity we add or carry out in an array. Also, there are different methods and different functions we could use in array to manipulate arrays to actually add, remove, shift, or reposition elements in array. We could also filter an array by using a condition to say any condition that isn't met should be removed from the array. All these are different possible methods and different possible activities that can be done in an array, and it's important for you to understand this when going into working with arrays. Also understand that array is one of the simplest way you could use to store any list of items, whether related or unrelated. Although object helps you store information of items that are related, information of properties or values that are related, but array can help you store information that are absolutely unrelated. So keep this in mind when working with arrays. Now over to functions. Now functions is one thing in JavaScript that is very critical in anything you want to do, because this is where you write majority of your business logic. This is where you write instructions that the application should carry out. There are three specific kinds of functions that we want to talk about today. The first function is a simple function that doesn't collect any parameter and doesn't return any value. The next function is a parameter function that collects a parameter and uses that information inside your app. The final function we're going to talk about is a return function that actually returns an information back to the user or back to the developer. Now, each of these functions have their different use cases. Sometimes we really do not need the function to do anything after it's done with the simple instructions it has. Sometimes we need the function to utilize inputs from the user or information outside the scope of the function to actually handle activities inside the function. Sometimes you want the function to actually let us know that it's done by giving us a final value that we might need to do something else. So let's get started with a simple function. A simple function is just a series of information happening inside a block of code, a series of instructions. So you could have a situation where talent seeker, Twitter handle, for example. These are all simple information. The next thing you want to do is say here console.log what is your full name. Let me just put that there. Or rather, is this your full name? The next thing, what this does, it simply initializes a new variable called full name and prints that full name in a sentence in the console window. The way to call a function is simply by saying simple function with the parentheses closed with the parentheses afterwards. This is actually the easy way to call functions. As you go further, there are ways to export functions and import functions. But for now, this is how you use functions in JavaScript. For parameter function, this is in situations where you're expecting the information to be imputed by a user or possibly from another operation in your JavaScript code. So for example, we are anticipating that the name would be given to us, and we could say something like this in the console, hello name. So what this does is if I impute a name in the parameter argument, it will say hello and that name. So for example, we would call the parameter function just like we call any simple function, but this time we're going to add a variable in the parentheses. So for example, Augustine. So this would say hello Augustine if printed in the console window. The last type of function is the return function. So this, when given an age, it actually returns a value, a predefined value for us. So for example, let's collect the year of birth. Let's give it a year of birth, and let's try to return the age. So we would say constant value because we don't want it to change. So we need a new date dot get full year minus year of birth. Now this would give us our age relative to the year of birth. So return function would be 1985. Now all this would actually return a value, but let's print our answer in the console log. So we have to say console.log and this. One important information I want you to understand on the course of this tutorial is that a function is also a variable. As you can see, we are printing this function just like we would print a simple variable. A function can store data just like a variable can, but there is a reason why it's called a reference data type, not a primitive data type. A reference data type means it's referencing the actual value, which in this case is age, but not in of itself storing it. So understand that as well when working with functions, that a function can actually act like a variable. So let's run our code to see if everything works. So you can see, is this your full name, talent seeker Twitter handle, which is for the simple function. The next one is hello Augustine, which is basically for the parameter function. And the last one is not a number. So it's trying to tell us that our calculation is wrong. So let's do a little bit of debugging. Let's see how to fix our codes. We would come back to line 17, which is where the activity happens. And we say the year of birth is 1985, and the get full year is actually a method. So I have to put this in parentheses. So if I were to call the file again, the JavaScript code, it's going to show 38. So that's pretty much how you handle different functions and also with a little bit of debugging, right? So thank you actually for watching this little tutorial on JavaScript, and I hope it helps you really have a feel of what JavaScript is all about and also relatively the simplicity that comes with JavaScript. I want you to also look at other videos that exist on different parts of building websites, simple web pages, and using JavaScript for other fun stuff. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.